You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
My background is a physical therapist. I've been doing it for about 20 years, mostly in an outpatient setting, but I started off in acute rehab with people that, rehabbing post-stroke, post-brain trauma, post-removal brain tumors, right? And had a pretty good perspective of, human health and how things, when they go wrong, can affect you. I would say the last 5 to 6 years of practice, I was exposed to it's kind of a newer. At the time it was a digitization of how to get a lactate curve, right? Because there's a lot of different ways to do that. Last I looked, there's over 20 different ways to try to describe what's happening there. So we started kind of toying with it, and the goal, at least with an outpatient orthopedic setting, we were looking at, this has been historically applied in a performance and elite athlete setting, right? Most people that have access to this kind of technology are going to be an endurance athlete, whether they're runners or cyclists or whatnot. And then on the other extreme in healthcare, in critical care, in settings where there's sepsis, they monitor lactate, because if you can clear lactate, that's a good sign that there's going to be a good outcome, right?
Sure.
And if you can't clear it, it continues to accumulate. And so then as I'm playing with this and kind of exploring and, tinkering, right? You get new toys, you start tinkering around with some of this stuff. But I started seeing in my patient population, right? I'm in the middle of Illinois, central Illinois. We got a mix of, farmers, farming families, along with, manufacturing and like State Farm, right? Where we have, executive administrative type people too. So we have this whole spectrum of people that are moving or not moving. So in my mind, it was like, well, why are we using this for the entirety of the population? It has this kind of value, right? And it's adjacent to the story of utilizing cardiopulmonary exercise testing, like a VO2 max model, which is historically has been the gold standard to define or describe fitness as VO2 max. Right?
Well, isn't lactate defined as the energy that the cells use for intense exercise? I mean, isn't it the fuel? So, or is that too simple?
No, I think it's a good description of it, right? Because you've got a cell, right? And you got cell space, and then within that space is a mitochondria, right? And in the cell space itself is where your glucose is living, right? Our bodies don't use glucose necessarily directly. It has to be broken down, right?
Sure.
And the end of it is going to be lactate. I think if you look at a textbook and what the dogma's been, the end was pyruvate, right? Mm-hmm. But we're at a point now, I guess, with understanding from the literature that lactate is the end product of breaking down a glucose, right, molecule. So lactate gets broken down, and then there's even more recent evidence that lactate is actually going inside the mitochondria all the way into the matrix, right? So inside the mitochondria itself, historically, it's never been demonstrated that it goes into the mito. It had to get converted to pyruvate, and then that gets converted again to get into the mitochondria, right? So
which is like the Krebs cycle.
Yeah. So the Krebs cycle is really the entry point where lactate ultimately gets converted to pyruvate and then acetyl-CoA, and then if you memorize all this stuff. But the whole point of the TCA...
I remember my biology.
Yeah. Right. And the whole point of that TCA cycle is to, create reducing agents, like they call it NADH and FADH2, NAD plus, right? NAD is popular as a supplement now and things like that. So, but that stuff goes over the electron transport chain, right? And then you've got protons that get shot through into the intermembrane space of that mitochondria, creates that proton gradient that drives the production of ATP, right? And then we've got electrons that are kicked along these parts, right, of that chain, and ultimately that's being accepted by oxygen, and you make essentially metabolic water, right? You create water within the mitochondria. So for lactate, you're right, it's a fuel, right? It's being oxidized, fundamentally as a carbohydrate. It's not a carb, but it's an intermediate, um, along with fat oxidation, right? Because you can only oxidize fat at the mitochondrial level, but you can break down glucose without oxygen, right? That's what glycolysis is. So,
Yep.
um, from a lactate standpoint, at least for people like Bruce Gladden and George Brooks, which are kind of leading the rebranding of lactate, right? It's not really about lactic acid; it's lactate. It's not a waste product. It's actually multiple things, including something that can actually affect the transcription or how DNA is going to be stimulated at the nuclear level, right? Um, so this thing about lactate, right? And let's just say at rest right now, we each take our own lactate level. And let's say I'm 1.2 and you're 1.0, right? And then if I have somebody that is dealing with a metabolic dysfunction or is significantly maybe more sedentary than either of us, they might have 1.6, 1.8, 2.0, right? And it's just a measurement, right? Just kind of like how we would measure glucose. But as we started moving, right, most of the time I see in generally healthy active population is that lactate level starts going down when I'm sampling, right? So there's a consumption or a disposal of lactate as we start moving, and there's a whole story behind that, right? But on quite a few people that I find, it doesn't change, and it starts accumulating pretty early on. So if you think about a graded exercise test, we've got a couple different ways we do it, but let's just say we start at 15 watts, right? And I've got somebody at 1.2 millimolar as their starting lactate level at rest, and they start pedaling, and then it goes down to 1.0, and then we go to the 30 watt, and then it gets to 0.8, 0.8. What does that mean? Like, what is happening inside the body? And if I have somebody else on there and they start at a 1.2, and next thing I know, at 30 watts, they're a 1.8, and then at 45 watts, they're 2.1, right? That's an accumulation of lactate systemically when we sample versus a clearance at an early power output, right? So the behavior of lactate from rest to movement is really what is interesting for us in the general population as you start looking at trying to scale almost the quality of an exercise physiology lab, right? So when we do the graded exercise test in those stages, we get a curve, right? You just plot every point of lactate relative to your watts or your power output, for example, on a bike. And we've got, quite a few people in all ages that accumulate lactate very quickly, right? And then what does that signify? And what does that represent at a physiological, systemic metabolic systemic level? And I would argue that it's not good at all.
What, to accumulate lactate? I always thought that was good. Yeah, I mean, well, at rest, but at exercise, if somebody can accumulate a large amount of lactate and then clear it really fast, that's a good indicator of health and fitness and capacity.
Correct. Yep. Yeah. So the context here is just on a test, right? And if let's just say I'm 100 kilo and I'm on the bike and I already start accumulating lactate at 45 watts, which is really a low power output. And again, what does that mean because when we sample lactate, right, whether it's a fingertip or an earlobe, you get a level, and that's a level that's in the system, right? But that is the net product of the rate, what lactate is being accumulated versus what is being disposed of, right? So it's the net product. And when we look at lactate curves, from low power on the left and high power all the way to the right, if my lactate curve blows up fast and I don't have that flat curve where it's indicative of clearing lactate at higher and higher power outputs, again, this is on a test. It's either going to signify that I'm accumulating it very fast and can't dispose of it, right? And then the clearance capacity, obviously, I can dispose of it, and I'm oxidizing, or I'm using it as a fuel, right? Over the course. So yeah, so if let's just say we apply, your observation into just a power athlete, right? Like a sprinter, right? It's like, I want to be able to get a high output, a high acceleration, high speed, be able to maintain that for whatever that duration is. But yeah, there's going to be a dependence on those fuels that, are more glycolytic, and you're going to elevate that lactate. But again, to your point, the repeat performance is really important. And if you have capacity to oxidize that lactate, in a shorter period of time, you're going to probably be able to repeat performance, right? And that's, I guess that's the application in that sense. If I'm just performing, right, and doing an event versus, the ability to clear lactate at higher power outputs or higher velocities of running, right? That's going to be a substantial difference in performance if I can clear lactate at those higher levels and sustain those.
We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Do you want to build thick, sidewalk-splitting slabs of muscle? Let me introduce you to Jack Street. Get access to the same tried and true training methods I followed during my 10 years in the NFL, all to walk into training camp at 308 pounds at sub 8% body fat. Punch your ticket to the gain train and join thousands of residents already following Jack Street. Head to powerathletehq.com/Jack Street and claim your 7-day free trial today. Now back to the show. What would be like the mitigating factors for it? I mean, I would imagine that the bigger an athlete is and the more muscle they carry, the more lactate they're going to produce. So like you would see higher numbers. I mean, so I trained professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighters, and we did a whole series of Tabata sprints on the Echo bikes. And they were hitting anywhere from 14 to 1,700 watts on a 20-second sprint, and then 10 seconds rest. At the end of that 4 minutes, they were somewhere between like 19 and 20 millimoles when we tested. I did not necessarily. I mean, now I don't remember. Well, I didn't test them pre, which is dumb. Now that, as you were talking about it, I should have created a curve. But the one thing which was pretty interesting was we tested them, gave them 4 minutes rest, and all of a sudden they were down in like the 3s and the 4s before we started again. I mean, they're also, trained multiple times a day, pretty strong, all, not carrying a ton of body fat. They're also in their early 20s. I mean, there's a lot of factors for this. It was pretty interesting to see not only like the cognitive kind of disassociation when they got in those high amounts, and then as they got more used to being there, all of a sudden their cognitive ability dramatically improved. So it felt like a dosing effect. Like at first when they got off in that first time we did it, they didn't know if they were in Texas or Brazil. And then all of a sudden, 2 months down the road, they're getting off and they're spelling their names and doing math equations that I would throw at them, like what's 4 times 4, what's 5 times 5, and what address did you grow up on? Spell your name backwards. And so I started testing them when they got off the bike, and their cognitive ability went through the roof. Because what I wanted them, they fight anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, have to recover and be able to do it again. So I wanted them to, be present. But I found that they, over time, that first one, they thought they were going to, legs were going to explode. They thought they were going to throw up. And then over the course of dosing them, it felt like all of a sudden the effects that we saw in the first few didn't extend past after a few months.
Yeah. And I think that, that capacity, it'd be interesting to take, people that have been out or just find a control, right? Maybe some coaches in there that, what does it look like on their rate of clearance? You know what I mean? So in that 3 minute or 4 minute session of recovery in between your intervals, we find, especially in non-trained people, that lactate level doesn't drop, right? Once you hit it and you elevate it, it's a very slow recovery. They're not clearing very well because they probably haven't developed the capacity to clear lactate. And the capacity to clear lactate is predominantly going to be done in a type 1 oxidative fiber or a hybrid of that, where most of your mitochondria live, because that's where you're going to oxidize. And in that short time frame, you're not going to shun it to the liver and go into what is, gluconeogenesis or convert lactate back. It just doesn't happen in that short period of time, right? So it's got to go somewhere, and it's got to be oxidized, right? If you're clearing it, it's something's consuming it, right? So whatever that training modality you guys have been doing historically, and it might be a duration, right? I don't know how these guys have been in that level of condition and sustained it at least a minimal level for maybe years, right?
Yeah.
Having that oxidative base. Yeah.
They've competed at, these kids have been they're in their 20s, professionals, and they've been doing this since they were 8 to 10 years old. What was interesting was that they did not come from a standard strength conditioning background. So when they came in, had all those amazing newbie gains, basic linear progression, but just adding in some kind of max effort type stuff, and then being able to really drive up their wattage. But I wish I had done the lactate testing really early, like day one. It wasn't until we were almost a year in that, Tom Newman suggested it. And then, just trying to get the numbers, it was, I should have run a much more formalized test, and I kind of regret not doing it. But the one thing I was impressed by was how fast they were clearing. But also, you think about, big, strong athletes. This is what they do for a living, recovery, no injury. All these things that I'd love to have a sampling. And you said like controls, of different age athletes. I think as we age, our ability to have these repeated efforts probably diminishes. But also, I was just reading a bunch of stuff about mitochondrial density, decreasing as we age. And that would make sense if lactate's a major player in that. Your ability to probably process lactate through mitochondria probably decreases with age.
This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market. We've built an online training business by partnering with Train Heroic to deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Hammer, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training. And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best training tech in the business, head to trainheroic.com/powerathletehq. And now back to the show.
Yeah, there seems to be like an unavoidable rate of decay, but a difference between, and I think in the literature, it's, if you compare an 80-year-old masters athlete to just a moderately active 50-year-old, you can still have that level of fitness in your older, as you're aging. Part of it is, how do things change relative to the stimulus? Because I don't think it's just, you accept that aging and it's gonna, there's gonna be a level of erosion or decay and metabolically that is, anchored to mitochondria and muscle fiber type, right? But I've got a sample now that we're doing in a fitness center, and the average age I think is 65, and we're doing these lactate tests with them. And I've got, late 60-year-old males and females that have pretty high, what I would consider metabolic fitness, since I'm measuring it through lactate and that oxygen, carbon dioxide.
What test are you using? What's the test you're using?
So we developed a lactate testing platform, right, to measure metabolic fitness. So I call it a SMART test. It's an acronym: Sustained Mitochondrial Aerobic Respiration Training. So it's a graded exercise test. It's at, it's meant to be, the model was designed to be deployable and pragmatic, right, and consistent, so that it's useful from one test to the next to see whatever you're doing in between, is it making an impact on whatever those training goals or outcome is. So we use an upright or recumbent cycle. We like power, so we measure power, we measure heart rate, and we measure lactate. So, and that gives us essentially your curve, right? And they do whatever the training's going to be. We have a training platform that is associated with it, so we close the feedback loop, and we can control the intensity and that intensity discipline for people relative to the physiological markers that we're acquiring. So they deploy that, give it, I could see changes within 3 weeks. I could see changes, 12 to 16, however you want to do those retest cycles, and then we get a new curve, right, from the second test, and then you're just comparing what happened, right? And what we always look for is that lactate curve to move rightward and flatten, right? And for us, that's the metabolic health benefit to training and testing through this type of using a lactate as a biomarker for that. So, and then you can see absolute changes, right? But the interesting ones are the relative, right? Well, what was my heart rate, right, relative to that lactate level last time and now? What is my heart rate relative to power output? What is my lactate level relative to power output? And those are the things that you start seeing, from a training adaptation standpoint, that are useful. So we've developed a platform that essentially triages people into one of 3 protocols, right? Like historically, it's been Bruce protocol. Everyone does it, same thing, and then you get your end product. But the whole point that I wanted to see is how close can we get to knowing or identifying that first threshold, that lactate threshold, right? And so it'll speed you up or slow you down based on your lactate clearance or accumulation early in the test. And then we can spot that, and then after that, it's kind of off to the races on trying to identify that second threshold, but then creating some kind of ceiling ultimately for them, because it is a submax test, right? This isn't designed to go, I mean, if you think about a critical power test, right, you're doing 3-minute all out, and then wherever you're planing off is technically that maximum metabolic state, essentially, right? And
are you testing the lactate in real time, or is it finger dabs or at different points?
Yeah, so we're sampling every 3 minutes. The stages start off, again, depending on where you're triaged. It could be, and really, this is the crazy thing, is that when we started working with people that were metabolically very unhealthy and unwell and sedentary, comorbid, right, dealing with a lot of diseases, we had to create a 10-watt protocol, because that was, to understand where they're at and to identify, even if they have a first threshold. A lot of them live beyond it, right, and there's implications to that. But we sample from the earlobe on a bike every 3 minutes, and then the algorithms, everything's automated, so it tells you, what's the next power output. We start at 15. It might be a 30-watt protocol. We start at 15, we go to 30, then it's 60, 90, 120. It could be a 15-watt protocol, 15, 30, 45, 60. Again, sampling at every stage. And that's, I mean, it builds the lactate curve on our platform, and we share that afterward on what that story is. What did lactate tell us about your current metabolic fitness, essentially?
And then in a perfect world, like, what would you want to see? Somebody being able to, attain a high lactate or, low lactate. I'm just curious. Like, I mean, we know it's gonna happen, and I guess the bigger and the stronger and the harder they go, the higher the number. But for, I guess, the general population of people you're looking at, are you looking at for their ability to clear it, or like how high or how low, or can they get to the same duration at a lower heart rate with less lactate?
Yeah, so the goal in our application and our model is we want to identify your lactate clearance capacity. So as soon as you hit that threshold and you start accumulating, what does that tell us about your level of fitness, right? And in cycling, the concept is watts per kilogram, right? And that's how they compare cyclists, amateurs, professional. They can even predict, going into an event who might be, top 3 based on that. Historically, I believe in cycling, watts per kilogram, it's been looked at the second threshold, right? They're more interested in, I can't remember, a threshold power, I think they would describe it as. So it was a few years ago, I started looking at this. I'm like, well, it's a good concept. It's a great way to compare within an individual how much change there is from test to test, if I'm looking at lactate, but also between individuals, right? And I know BMI isn't a great, it's got it's a problem, obviously, right? But it's still used in healthcare, and statistically, it still pans out that higher BMIs, right, have higher risks. And
people attack it, but the only people that are outliers for it are people that lift weights and are pretty healthy. So, the military. I always like the military's. What was it, like? Half of your height has to be like, what is it, equal to your waist? So if you're 80 inches, you better have a 40-inch waist. If it's outside that, I always thought that was a pretty good, quick indicator. But for the most part, people crap on the BMI, but for the most population that isn't training, it's actually pretty accurate.
Yeah, and for me, and then the literature, again, that it support, like, I'm a consumer of this stuff, right? I also create knowledge and understanding with this, but it's not, I'm a clinician that's going into partial academics and research. I outsource the research, to smarter people, essentially, that are in this stuff. So, that BMI concept, what really is a modulator of risk for people living with higher BMIs is having higher fitness, right? I could have a normal BMI, normal body weight, and low fitness, but that person that is overweight and or obese that has a higher fitness level can potentially have a lower risk, right? So I think the thing we haven't appreciated, because there's nothing that's been scaled of it, is the importance of cardiorespiratory fitness for health, and the maintenance of health given anything else that I'm doing, whether I'm, pre-diabetic, or if I'm obese, or I've got hypertension, or risk for cancers, right? The risk for having problems, if you are low fit, is multiples higher, right? And that's the crazy part. And that's what I'm trying to, I was in healthcare, and there was one point, I think it was 2018, American Heart Association had a position statement on cardiorespiratory fitness, and they want to make it a vital sign, right? And it's like, well, why aren't we measuring this if it's one of the most important things that are out there that will define what your trajectory is going to be within a given amount of time? But it hasn't been scaled at all. I mean, there might be, I think, maybe a 6-minute walk test or something that they use in cardiology as a snapshot. But
I was going to ask, like, how are they defining whether or not you're cardiovascularly fit or not for risk factor?
Yeah, so it's, there's registries, right? And one that I use is the Friend Registry out of Ball State. And Ball State's got it's kind of a mecca of exercise physiology, right? And they've got a registry of all ages, all sexes, all races, and they look at, well, where are people coming to the table at year one? And then when they look at them over time, 20 years, 30 years, these longitudinal studies, and they look at, well, the people that are really healthy are maintaining higher fitness levels, right? And as you age, the higher you can maintain that fitness over the life course, the less risk you have of developing X, Y, and Z. Right. So there are registries out there, and there are, essentially, they've developed some thresholds, right? On thresholds meaning numbers, like you're above this number and your risk is lower, you're below it, and it's a lot higher. So we'll just say, for example, if you have a low VO2 max, and we might define that as a 15 or a 17, based on that measurement, which is, milliliters per kilogram per minute. That really puts you at a higher risk if you get sick, right? And you need hospitalization, or do you need a more dependent recovery, meaning skilled nursing or prolonged hospitalization, right? And this could be given anybody's fitness from any age, technically. I mean, we think of it maybe more as middle-aged and older adults that are going to be more vulnerable to this, but having a low fitness has been correlated with having poorer outcomes, right? From that standpoint. So I guess that would be an example of cardiorespiratory fitness as having a correlation to health. But the cardiorespiratory fitness has been tied into, risk for diabetes, risk for cancers, risk for cardiovascular disease, right? So again, the higher that number is, the lower the risk you are. But again, across the healthcare continuum, there really is no standard of care for measuring fitness. And that was part of the motivation, like, well, we can scale a lactate model, because technically we can test, and we have tested up to 4 people at once, right? Whereas if you're testing in a VO2 model, that's challenging, right? Most of the time people have 1 cart, and they can only do that whatever given time period between that. So, and make it accessible, right? That was the other part of it, was to make the assessment of fitness scalable, so that everyone would have an opportunity, even like at a well check, right? And it's like, you get your ApoB, you get your your lipid, your glucose profiles, and whatnot, hormones. But, well, where are you from a fitness standpoint? Because if you are low fitness, there's a good chance that metabolically at that cellular level, things are gradually eroding, right? And we know for fitness and metabolic health changes can take time. It doesn't happen immediately, but maybe the result of that, like a cardiac event, is immediate. But there's a lot of value, and it's currently undervalued, in my opinion, of standardizing and measuring fitness as a way to really measure health, right? Not ill health, but really what is additive health, and this is a great marker for that.
So how do we access this to the masses? I mean, for people listening to this podcast, and especially people that follow our training, fitness, and more importantly, like having a big aerobic base, developing GPP is just a function for allowing you to, train harder, quicker recovery in between sets, being able to handle a higher volume of work. If you're physically out of shape, it's extremely hard to train with any volume because you're so, beat down and under recovered that you can't put together enough consecutive days. That's something that I've seen not only in boxing and jiu-jitsu, but all the wrestling stuff. I mean, the people with a higher level of fitness can train at a greater level of intensity with more frequency. Therefore, they have greater chance of success because they just have more opportunity. And I really believe opportunity is the greatest single factor for athletic achievement. If you have the opportunity to play and do something more than other people, you're going to be better. It's like chess. So the function of, conditioning and, physical readiness, and, you go back and, the GPP stuff from the Russians is a real factor, but it's always been more of a driver for, more training. Whereas now we're looking at it more for health and longevity and fitness and just, assessing factors so that people, don't peel out and die. I mean, I saw recently an interesting statistic that I think was like 98% of men will either die of a heart attack or cancer. And, you can mitigate heart attack by, the Finland deal with the saunas, exercise, getting, 10 to 15,000 steps a day. I mean, those are real statistics, and it seems easy enough to just go out for a walk, but yet people find it extremely challenging.
Yeah, and to the point I made earlier, when people have this lactate clearance capacity that is so impaired, and they're accumulating almost nearly out of the gate. So if I'm, sedentary and I'm sitting in the lazy boy, and then I get up and take a walk, there's a good chance that during that walk I'm accumulating lactate. I'm not clearing it at that point because I'm so unfit. The system is so it has such a low capacity, right? And I end up living in a glycolytic state, right? And predominantly, right? And you can imagine if you're dependent in that state, or it's a state that you live in most of the time for any kind of movement, whether it's in the house or to the garage, in the car, or at the grocery store. People are going to probably fatigue. They're going to probably not like moving. I think the visceral and subjective experience of exercise and movement is unpleasant, especially for a lot of people, and they avoid it, right? I'm more comfortable when I'm not moving. So how do you make that transition or that bridge? And I feel like we've done a nice job of when you take people through, that submaximal test, and everyone finishes different. If you're pretty unfit, that test is going to be done pretty quick, right?
Sure.
But it gives gives them a frame of reference of where they're at, and then you describe what that future can look like, right? And our platform is really designed on what is the intensity at those individual thresholds, because that's kind of where they're at, and we're meeting them where they're at, right? And that's what they can tolerate. So we train them there, right? And that's where we start trying to build up volume at intensity, right? Which would include steady state, but also includes the introduction of intervals if they haven't done it before. And if you can think about, we're trying to stay essentially, if you think of a polarized concept, we're staying below the first threshold. So I'm not really accumulating a lot of stuff, right? And that's really a tolerable place for a lot of people to grow, right? And build on volume, build on consistency and regularity. Because I always try to get people to do some movement on a daily basis. It's kind of, I don't say it's ridiculous that you even have to think about moving on a daily basis, but the environment in the world as it is structured, you just don't need to move much anymore, right? And we need that mechanical, physical stimulation that, essentially translates or transduces at that cellular level to stimulate things. You can't do it any other way, right? There's, even with nutritional components and calorie restriction, there's only a limited amount of mitochondrial stimulus you're going to get from that. You have to move, right? And I think when we get there, and instead of thinking, like a lot of people have thought about exercise, as weight loss or failed weight loss, and getting frustrated, or even, again, like I talked about, that subjective experience of, this is just not pleasant, I'm not going to do it. And they may not have been doing that for 30 years at the point we've seen them, right? Or 40 years. It's like, well, this is where we need to start, right? And if we start here and then we retest you in 4 weeks, what does it look like? It's like they step on the scale, they see there's no weight loss, so that means I'm metabolically unhealthy. But if we look like, and they've got a better lactate clearance curve, things are changing in the cell now, right? They're appreciating that, and it motivates them to continue to move forward because they're starting to see an objective change and outcome relative to that. And it's such a, a lot of people, it's such a low starting level, right? Versus, I would imagine, working with, consistent athletes, and competitive athletes. But again, that was the point of this whole platform is, how do we how do we engage people that just aren't moving much or don't like moving? And then how do we get them to get on a program that continues to progressively elevate their metabolic health? Because if we focus on this one thing, and I've done, we collect, traditional vitals. We use impedance, just to look and get a snapshot of body composition, right? And if we focus on this one thing, right, which is lactate clearance capacity, and I've created a score, an index for that one point of where that changes, essentially. It's kind of like, your VO2 max is at kind of that peak point, but I'm looking at when we become, we go from that oxidative capacity for using fat as a fuel, for using lactate as a fuel, but then there's spillage, right? And that's why we get the accumulation of lactate in the system. I'm looking at that point and then comparing that point from test to test. And that's really our key point. It's a way to use a metabolic fitness test to try to gather their current metabolic fitness. I call it metabolic fitness because it's lactate, but also that concept of metabolic flexibility at that sign, right? And if I've got this low clearance capacity, I'm metabolically inflexible, and there's a lot of things downstream that are problematic, right? And
so if somebody can't clear lactate because of a low level of fitness, their ability to use both carbohydrates and fat as an energy source is just nil.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
It's certainly impeded and impaired.
Sure.
And that's why we start getting, fat accumulation, inside the liver, pancreas, kidneys, like ectopic fat, right? It's like, well, it's not supposed to be there, but it's got to go somewhere.
Sure.
And that becomes certainly a problem. But I'm glad you brought up that they're impaired with using carbs as well, right? They're just not even good at that. And I think that gets missed sometimes.
This is an interesting marker. I mean, there's, as you're talking, I constantly have to remember like the general population who tends to be, I think, culled a lot with what I call, magic for diet. Like, carbs are evil. Don't eat carbs. Your body doesn't need them. And I'm like, well, maybe. I mean, this stuff's all dose but dependent. If you're a high level athlete that's competing and you're, well established, very metabolically flexible individual, yeah, you can handle more carbohydrate. If you're sitting on the couch all day and do no physical exercise, you probably don't get any carbs. And, it's the other one. I feel like when we run into people that have never exercised, there's kind of this like net sum, one is none, kind of zero effect. Like, if I can't do this, then it's better to not do anything. And like, I'm so physically unfit, I can't train, I can't lift weights, I can't run and all this. And it's like, well, I mean, I've never met anybody that's done a VO2 max that thought, that was a great time, let's do that again. I've done VO2 maxes on the treadmill, I've done them on echo bikes. I mean, every time it's awful. You get to that 10 minute and you're like ready to collapse. So I think when people think about metabolic testing, or they do the what's the cardiac test that they
stress
do?
Test, maybe?
Yeah, there's like the stress test and that. I mean, those are not fun, and I've had to do them, and I would never recommend that anybody do those. It's like, hey, every week let's do a VO2 max test. Yeah. But I feel like those are the only testing, and I don't know, even though I know you're talking about it and everybody's talking about it, like just go out for a walk, get out, just start. Day one, do this. Just start moving. And I don't know if people understand that it's that easy. So maybe like what you guys are doing in terms of testing and showing like, hey, here's these different pathways, here's your body's ability to include lactate, shows them that they're actually making these kind of little micro processes or these little progress opposed from like, I haven't gained any weight, I don't feel any different. But yet now all of a sudden they don't get winded bringing their groceries in, or, they walk out to the mailbox, they're not feeling, having to stop and rest.
Yeah, meet them where they're at, right? And I'm not trying to create, a package system and they've got to come in and immediately, I think, I guess, historically the Biggest Loser type stuff, right? Where, that was the mechanism, that was the effort that you needed to do. But to your point, walking is a wonderful way to, build some health and capacity going from nowhere. But I think the value that we bring is we meet people where they're at, right? And the test is submaximal, right? And you don't have to wear a mask, because I've got a lab and I've got a cart, and I do my protocols along with, measuring, VO2 and VCO2, and people hate it. I've had people rip it off, and I don't know if it's because of the last few years of that stuff, or if it's just they don't, it's suffocating in a way. And it's not, technically, but everyone's got a different response. And some of the value, I think, of doing that kind of objective test, right, is the health literacy behind it. Because people don't, mean, people have fitness, they got perceptions of what fit means, right? And maybe that's aesthetic, right? And, but, when you meet them where they're at and you show them that, and then you get them, obviously you got to get them motivated and adherent to do a program, right? Which is, for us, it's pretty simple, right? When coming out of the gates. But then when we retest, and again, we've had, I got multiple examples even this last week, of people's curves start changing and what that means for them. And I brought this up earlier because what you see when you address this level of fitness and you start moving the needle, everything else that we treat in silos starts to kind of decompress. Right. So blood pressure starts coming down, resting heart rate starts lowering. Right. If we're taking any of the traditional biomarkers, I see triglycerides start dropping, lipids start dropping. Right. It's like, this is the thing. If we can capture that, is going to take stress off the system. Obviously, if you combine it with a nutrition program, it's even going to be amplified. But in my conceptual framework of this, if you do not change what's happening at a cellular level, mitochondrial level, metabolic flexibility level, you're always going to be fighting against the current, right? Whether you're taking GLPs or whatever you're doing, at some point in the baseline, that has to be resilient, and you got to have some capacity there. Otherwise, you just keep, because at some point you're just going to add more medicine to it, right, or more pharma, and you're always going to be chasing it. And and this is why I'm so passionate about, at least at the very least, getting a fitness assessment where you at, get a plan, and then get a reassessment. I think those retesting cycles, I call them recalibrating, right?
Sure.
Because your body's changed, right? Let's recalibrate. Let's see where you're at. Now let's do this, right? And that's where you get growth and progress, and you start seeing all this other stuff that we're chasing, right? We're not managing it very well. And how I would describe as being health additive, right? Yeah. Going back to that one point I was talking about with metabolic flexibility, right? Because I didn't complete that thought on the watts per kilogram from cycling, because I've just played with that a little bit more and developed it. And for me, it's watts that you are able to produce, right? So that's the external load, heart rate and lactate, or that internal load or stress. And how do those dance together, right? And at that point of that first threshold, I look at watts at first threshold relative to your BMI, right? And then a multiplier. So it ends up giving you a scale of like 0 to 100 plus, right? And I've had 3 people they were triathletes and elite cyclists that were over 100, right? We had a professional cyclist out of Pennsylvania that had like a 120 on it. But
what was the equation? You were saying watts times body weight.
Yeah, it's watts at your first threshold. So let's just say my first threshold was identified at 100, right? Mm-hmm. And I've got a BMI of 25, so I just do 100 over 25, and that's a 4, and then I multiply that by 10, and that gives me a 40, right? So it was just a way to create a scale that people are familiar with, right? Like grade school and that 0 to 100.
Sure.
And really, that's the oxidative capacity at first threshold. That to me is the phenotype, and that's the value for health. That doesn't require max testing and wearing a mask and stuff like that. It just, I don't know how much you're familiar with the literature, but they look at VO2 max as kind of like the centralized characteristic of fitness, whereas if you're measuring lactate, it's more what's happening in the periphery, in the muscle cell, and obviously mitochondrial level. And they both have value, and they're both complementary, right? And I think of VO2 max, and that's a good thing. But I think the crazy thing to me, even in the literature, when these scientists are getting a VO2 max, then they go back and just say, do 60% of your VO2 max. It's like, well, you could have found the thresholds. Why don't you find the thresholds and have people train there, rather than, it's like an age-based heart rate approach, right? 220 minus your age.
Yeah, which has failed dramatically. I don't even tell anybody when they ask, like, oh, how do I find my heart rate? I'm like, you got to try to find your max heart rate. For me, it's somewhere between 191 and 195. And I'm 47, 220 that doesn't work for me. So then when I go back and I do my zones, and I do So my history, I played in the NFL for a decade, and I gave no credence and no support of developing an aerobic base. I thought it was horse shit. I thought it was NSAM bullshit. I figured lift heavy weights, be as dynamic as possible, sprint and run, and that's all I did for my conditioning. And after I retired, we were testing some of the programs we do here at Power Athlete, and one of them was a bodybuilding program. And part of the bet that I had to make was I had to lose 10% of my body weight for this contest we were doing. And so I was stuck and was like, shit, man, I'm going to put in some, it's a calorie deal. I'm eating a certain amount of calories. I'm training. I'm kind of monitoring it. My scale's not moving. I'll just start doing some aerobic work. So I started doing like 30, 45 minutes walk. And then I couldn't get my heart rate up fast enough. So I started wearing a weighted vest. And then I got to the point where I was doing like a recumbent exercise, like echo bike, assault bike. And then I got to the point where that wasn't working. And then I went to just the step mill because I saw that there were all these girls at the gym. They were all super fit. They were like sprinting up this stair machine. So I jumped on the stair mill and I'd go for 45 minutes. At the end of, what it was like 16 weeks or something, we did this deal. I not only PR'd every single lift, I was, 7-8% body fat, and my capacity was through the roof. And I was probably the strongest I've ever been. And at that point I sat back and was like, shit, I made a huge mistake. I did not realize the power of not only to be able to recover, I was monitoring my sleep at the time, what it was doing for my sleep, and just in terms of maintaining low body fat. So it's something that I've tried to include, but, it's one of those things where, it's easy to get to the gym and this, but, to find that 30, 45 minutes to go out and do some zone 1, zone 2 stuff, and then also be able to stay within that heart rate. Because I think for me, I always want to push harder. Mm-hmm. And I know exactly for me, it's about 120 to 130 beats a minute is what I got to stay in, which is kind of boring. And, to stay there.
That's the major complaint. Right? This is just boring.
It's terrible. Like before this podcast, that's what I did. I did my 30 minutes. I got on the assault bike and I'll listen to a podcast or, prep for something. And it's 125 to 130 beats. And I got to stay there for somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes. And if I can do that 5 days a week, all of a sudden, all of the markers for me, not only with body fat, but for sleep and this, everything just tends to go up. And it's, the big one too is I go do jiu-jitsu a couple nights a week because I train those pro guys. So I started doing it. But the ability to be able to recover in between, like if you roll for 3 minutes and take a minute, that ability to, take a deep breath and recover fast is I can see it in real time when I don't do the preparatory kind of zone 1, zone 2 boring work. I see it in everyday things. Like when I'm at jits, I feel like, hey, I didn't recover as fast. Oh, dude, I haven't been doing that. And it's probably 2 days on, 1 day off. If I can get 5 out of 7 days, I'm doing even better. Or it looks like going out and chopping wood or, doing something aerobic, but I always will wear my Apple Watch. So I'm always like, oh, this could be a workout maybe. But it could be that simple. I had a client who was overweight years ago, and we would come lift weights, and she's like, what should I do? And I'm like, take your dogs on a walk. She had these 2 huge shepherd dogs that were 100 pounds. And she couldn't walk them very far, so she had to hire a dog walker, and she wanted to be able to walk these dogs. By the time we were 3 months in, she could take them on a 2 or 3 mile walk. Her body hadn't necessarily changed that much, but just the fact that she had the capacity to do this was world, life-changing for her, which allowed her to have the confidence to go on and make more and more changes. So I am, and I always wonder if it's a function of age. Who was it? Dr. Michael Rose, who we mentioned on this podcast, had an interesting talk on fruit flies that he did for the Ancestral Health Symposium. But he said, based upon his, and I'm not going to go through his whole research, but if you want to check out the talk, it's great. But he talked about day 4 for a fruit fly lives about 7 days. They had to return back to their ancestral diet if they wanted to be able to make it. And so his whole claim is that at about age 40, you got to return back to your ancestral diet, which fits with what I hear from a lot of people where in my 20s and 30s, I could eat whatever I wanted. And now all of a sudden, if I ate that same way, I would not nearly be as healthy. And I think what happens is as we age, the margin of error starts getting very, very small. And we have to, start safeguarding sleep and, worrying about, actually monitoring and measuring calories, which I never did, looking and figuring out how much aerobic work I'm getting done. And I have to be much more strategic than I was probably in my 20s and 30s. And I think it's just a function of aging. Or, and I wish it wasn't that case. I wish we could all just take a magic shot and stay young forever. And I think the thing that we're getting into is that maybe fitness and training and doing these things weren't necessarily ingrained early on. Then all of a sudden people get a little bit older and be like, well, I didn't have to do that. Why do I have to do it now? And now it's become such a big, big factor for them.
Yeah, I mean, you made a lot of great points there, right? And I'll just respond with a couple things here. And one, there is no fountain of youth. If there is a fountain of youth, it's in a mitochondrial reticulum, right? And that's this energy grid that you can build up in essentially your type 1 muscle fibers, right? And the more you have, the more they're connected, the more those mitochondria are colonized in communities, the better off you can manage. And remember, it's just not the powerhouse of the cell, right? There's some other people that are really good and have some good literature on where this is going and what mitos are for, because they participate in the development of hormones depending on the tissue it lives in. It helps with your immune and your inflammation responses. So you can imagine if you don't have a very good colony support of mitochondria, you're going to have quite a bit of vulnerability. And this is why I talk about metabolic erosion. And a mitochondrial reticulum supports that. Martin Picard is a great one that's going in and better defining, when you brought up structure function, like mitochondrial content, mitochondrial function, what does that mean? And, those are probably multiple podcasts that you could have just to unpack that stuff, which is phenomenal. But to me, it ties into the lactate piece, right? If I've got this indirect observation of the capacity of those mitos is your lactate clearance capacity. And if you can't clear lactate and it blows up fast, you got to change something in your life. And the first thing is probably a consistent movement program. I think the thing that's really interesting that I learned, this metabolic assessment as we're going through and we look at, this lactate curve from, whatever the power is. When we get nearer at that threshold, there generally is this vagal withdrawal, right? And when we're oxidizers and we're really good and we've got that mitochondrial reticulum and we can clear lactate, we can live in a parasympathetic state for the most part, right? And when we get to that first threshold, there's a vagal withdrawal and the sympathetic system starts engaging more and more, right? And vagal system, and then vice versa as we come down. So to your point earlier of your athletes, your fighters that can go into a sympathetic state and drive that lactate up and then come back down. That's sympathetic vagal, right? I mean, think about that for military and first responders and having that capacity.
Sure.
Right? I get it when I need it, and then when I don't need it, I don't live there, right? And technically, even below first threshold, it's been shown that you can even recycle cortisol at that point. So, when I talk, with some of the first responders we work with, it's like, if you're stressed out and it was a rough day, don't go do hits, go down and do your sub-threshold steady state, and your mitos are going to help recycle a lot of that cortisol and, some of this other stress stuff, and probably even sleep better. You know what I mean?
Well, at its core, mitochondria is energy that goes to the cells. So, and then this is the deal. We live in this kind of, I guess, autonomic state, and you were going into metabolic flexibility, we are, by design, kind of similar to like in a hybrid car, we live in these autonomic states and we burn fat, and all of a sudden we get into exercise, heart rate, everything gets up. And now all of a sudden you move over and start using glucose as a fuel. And the mitochondria, those cells, actually from this podcast, which I didn't even realize, probably build more in those lower aerobic states. And, the problem is when we think about training, everybody's always thinking these upper registers, how hard did I get my heart rate? How high? Similar to like when we did, in CrossFit, where everybody was going in and literally ramping it up at 100% max intensity, increased work capacity, broad time modal domains. I'm going to die on the sword every single day. And it just wasn't sustainable for the large population. Were people fitter? 100%, but I think they shatter a lot of people. And we saw a lot of like metabolic distress from it. A lot of cortisol overload, a lot of, just a ton of issues. It was probably because they just didn't have the basic, boring zone 1, zone 2 stuff to do.
Yeah. And it's, technically, before the common or current era, right? I think of, an example would be Amish Lifestyle, right? And the males get over like 18,000 steps a day, along with all that manual labor, and they take in something like 800 plus more calories than we do. Obviously, it's probably a whole, different food, but I think there's been something lost, right? On even the pleasure of movement. Right. I remember growing up and it was play, right? It was a neighborhood play and it was, tag and red light, green light, ghost in the graveyard. And I don't even know, my kids didn't even really, they did that a little bit when we were in the, in one neighborhood, but I don't see kids doing that as much anymore. Everything's kind of segregated out and we're seeing this metabolic disease happening sooner and sooner. And again, I think I'm gonna put my finger on it that it's a movement-based issue, and physical activity is great. And the more you get, I think the better, the better the outcome. When we talk about, the history of CrossFitting, right? And just coming out of the gates and hammering it a lot, it's just, I think what you lose is the recovery cycles, right? And restoration and what role that plays. And that when we're working with, our customer base on this, to your point, a lot of it is going to be below threshold steady state. And I've had people do probably 95% of their training in that. And they may have, so are you familiar with metabolic equivalence and with the METs, it's just another way to measure, like physicians in healthcare, they talk about things in METs or physical activities in METs. And one MET is equivalent to 3.5 milliliters of oxygen, right? It's a derivative of VO2. So if I had a 35 VO2 max, I divide that by 3.5 and I've got a max MET of 10, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I look at that first threshold, I've had, most people coming through, they're sitting around 2 METs at that point. And then we do training, which is predominantly steady state, sub first threshold training. And it's volume duration at that intensity. And they come back and just by doing that, they move that to a 4. Right. So now they're a 4 MET at that point. And then they keep doing the same thing. We might pepper in some more interval training at that point. But now they're a 6. Right. And the guidelines from, CDC, National Institutes of Health, is 150 minutes of moderate activity per week or 75 minutes of vigorous. And they define moderate activity as 4 to 6 METs. Right. And I get people that are even below that. Right. They're below 4 when they start off, and then they can be 6 and above at the first threshold, right? So I think it's important to think about how capacity changes, relative to that. And that's part of the story that we provide people.
What's the first threshold? I mean, I don't remember if we talked about it early on, but you're measuring heart rate, you're measuring lactate, and then also wattage. What is that? I mean, you talked about 10, 15. I mean, for let's say a highly trained individual comes in and you want to hit that first threshold. Like, what would be the average at like 10 or 15 watts on the bike? Like, what would be their heart rate? What would be their lactate?
Again, it varies, right? And to your point, it could be age-based. It could be where you're coming from a training standpoint. Are you dealing with any, chronic conditions? Are you taking any medications, right? It just kind of gets hairier, the more unfit people are bringing to the table. But that first threshold, right? And you can think of it, I guess, as watts per kilogram. The people that are more fit are going to have that higher watts per kilogram, right? And that's, 4, 5, 6. And the lower ones, the crazy part is, we had a whole administrative office that we tested, 20 people. And they were all at about 0.5 watts per kilogram. Like, that's how low, that threshold was. But if you're going to define from a lactate standpoint what is happening, or how to define that first threshold, like I said earlier, there's at least a half dozen, formulas on how to do that. And we've established how we define that, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the most important part to this is that you have a consistent protocol, and it's standardized the best you can for kind of, I'll say more of like a casual physiology lab that's scalable. So we define that point, and once we see that point in the algorithm, right? And that's the description during that curve. And then whatever that intervention or training modality is going to be, you do a retest and then you compare it to that point. So how you find that point is the same. And whether it's, there's just a lot of different ways that I think that's part of why we jumped on it, because it's a fragmented, conceptually, it's fragmented on how you get there and understand it. But you got to make a decision. You can't just keep splitting hairs, right? And there's a lot of value to identifying what happens at that point. And it's not just lactate, right? So this is why I use a cart and I measure VO2 and CO2, because you can also get thresholds, right? And mm-hmm. There's certain things that you can look at in the behavior of the gas exchange. And I look at, like, where is lactate when I sample it, and how we define our thresholds, and how does it look relative to how carbon dioxide and oxygen behave. And it's like, it's crazy how it's always spot on, we get this change in in oxygenation, right? And it starts flattening out and then going up. And it's like, well, here's this point. And then I correlate it, right, with how we define lactate, and it's almost spot on, right? So you can use VO2 max, but they're just not using it like that. I think they're stuck on the max score, right? And they're not using these. I mean, technically, these two thresholds, whether it's ventilatory threshold 1, ventilatory threshold 2, lactate threshold 1, lactate threshold 2, those are the fundamental transition points, threshold transitions, however you want to call it. It's phenomena that happens, right? Something's changing homeostatically, right? That's how you get a 3-zone model, right? You got moderate intensity, first threshold, and then you got vigorous intensity, second threshold, then you got severe. And then anything that you build on that, a 5 or 7 threshold model, is just based off of coaching or what percent you want them working at relative to that. So, so when, to your point here is, we define the lactate threshold a certain way, and then we keep it consistent, from test to test. But that physiological threshold, as we measure it from lactate, has a consistent pattern to gas exchange as well. So again, physiologically, it's consistent, and then it's test to test. We're trying to continue to see that lactate curve flatten, which indicates better and improved lactate clearance capacity. And then we can infer other things that are happening, with the mitochondria and metabolic flexibility at that point too.
Is like the clearing of lactate, is it? What we saw was, because the exercise was so intense for such short periods, we saw a huge accumulation of lactate. And I wonder if there's like more steady state where you're developing lactate and clearing it kind of in real time, opposed from this like, hey, I'm going to, dam the river and try to get it as high as possible and then see how fast you can clear it, which, for our fighters was, I think was extremely beneficial. I mean, there were some really neat, I don't want to call them side effects, but adaptations. And I really think it comes down to that gas exchange, which when I explain people the gas exchange, I look at it like a plumbing almost. Let's say you have a house and you add rooms to the house, but you don't increase the plumbing and you don't add, and upgrade that. All of a sudden you add more people in the house and the plumbing's probably going to get backed up. And we see that quite often with a lot of younger athletes, especially when they put on, 20 or 30 pounds of body weight, maybe if they're taking performance enhancing drugs and they put on a bunch of excess body weight. We've seen this, especially in like the fight world. And all of a sudden these guys just gas out because they can't clear lactate. They can't clear it because they haven't done any of that gas exchange, any of that upgrading of the plumbing. And that's what I really saw benefit when we started going through all these different protocols, especially the accumulation of lactate, getting them to clear it really fast and getting them back on there and doing it again. All of a sudden, their gas exchange, I think, went through the roof. One of the other ways I test it, have you ever heard of a system called Hypermax Oxygen? It's a EWAT, exercise with oxygen.
That doesn't sound familiar. Yeah.
So what it is, it's an oxygen generator that pumps 93% oxygen into this like massive, like 10-liter balloon. It's like a big bag. And as you exercise, I'll wear the mask and try to push different levels to see how fast I can like either kill the bag or how slowly I can. And so if I ride at a higher intensity, obviously, you start breathing more and the bag goes down less and I can kind of time it. And the way that I track my fitness is to be able to ride at higher intensities and kill the bag slower. So a bag can, it might take anywhere from 12 to 14 minutes. If I can push it where I kill the bag at a high end, I know the different heart rate zones and I can kind of measure it. That's one of the ways I measure my intensity. And the reason I started doing that, we had a bunch of firefighters and they were using the training. And one of the feedbacks we kept getting is I'm not going through my bottles as fast.
Yeah.
So the training, I talked to a guy yesterday on a consult, firefighter, and he's like, I'm one of the smaller guys, stronger than a lot of the bigger dudes, but I don't burn through my oxygen as fast. And I think it comes from the training. And he's like, some of these guys are having to, leave after 3 to 5 minutes, get a new bottle, go back in. He goes, I can stay, 10 or 12 minutes on that bottle. So I started kind of found this EWAT system, which has been pretty interesting to know. We've been using it for a while, but that is a way I track my fitness, is how fast or how slowly I'm able to go through that bag.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It reminds me of a marker that we're following and it's in healthcare. You don't hear it a lot as a traditional vital sign or anything, but it's called the double product of the rate pressure product. It's your systolic blood pressure multiplied by your heart rate. And we look at it at rest, right? So what's the resting vitals? Somebody's systolic is something, right? And then their resting heart rate is whatever. And you can imagine people with sympathetic state at rest or poor fitness have elevated systolic blood pressures and elevated resting heart rates. We multiply those two, and then you get the rate pressure product. And that's been demonstrated over probably 34 years as an indirect way to measure or get insight to myocardial oxygenation, or the how the heart is taking up oxygen. And it's crazy how spot on this looks when people are low fit and they got this low metabolic flexibility. The patterns of, to your point, when you're lower fit, you're probably just chunking along and trying to get all this oxygen to, to maintain function. And then as you get more fit, right, you can see that systolic's down, resting heart rate's down, fitness is up. And it's a fun way to demonstrate that piece. But the crazy part about oxygen, and again, I've been studying biology for a long time, and I use it, but it never really clicked to me that the one place oxygen has to go, right? We got to breathe it in, nose and mouth, and then it's got to be transported all the way to the mitochondria. And there's essentially 5 complexes, right? 4 complex and ATPase, which is what's making the ATP for you. But it's complex 4 is where the electron comes back down and connects with the oxygen that you're breathing in, makes water. And then, that's how you lose weight or what your exhaust is. It's the carbon dioxide in the water that is coming out of your body. That's fundamentally, that always blew me away, and in order to, because if you think about the oxygen, like historically lactate was always framed around hypoxia or anoxia. There's not enough oxygen, right? And so now you're dumping lactate. But, again, the last 20, 30 years of research is like, well, that's not quite true, right? There's plenty of oxygen. There's plenty of pressure of oxygen at the mitochondrial level. I think you just don't have the mitochondrial scaled out enough to leverage the oxygen sufficiently. And that's the peripheral component to VO2, right?
Why did they fuck, not to cut you off, but how did they mess up, lactate and lactic acid for as long? I mean, I remember, as a young football player running and, the coaches being like, that burning in your legs, that lactic acid in your legs. And we always kind of assume that it was, and it's not, it's really the burning of the oxygen off. But, and then all of a sudden there was these lactate threshold tests and this, and everybody was talking about the burn. And then what was it? Probably about 20 years ago, the research was like, this is completely wrong. We've messed this up. And it's still, I still hear this myth kind of propagated all through, the exercise. Well, not necessarily this world. It's more on the bro science side.
It's hard to die, right? I mean, it's, and this is why we're trying to rebrand lactate. And that this is a really important, like in my opinion, I don't know if you remember, I don't know if it was the 90s was kind of the decade of the gene, right? The Human Genome Project. And now they're really getting to what's called metabolomics, right? And you can add omics to everything now, proteomics, transcriptomics, right? Everyone's analyzing everything based on capacity and technology now. And metabolism is taking kind of a new role even in cancer, right? Not just the genes and mutated genes in cancer, but how does a cancer cell metabolize? What does it use? Which is really interesting story for lactate as well. I think the literature goes all the way back. I think the last number I looked at was the year 1780 is when they chased down a deer, right? And then they were analyzing what was going on. And obviously you're chasing down a deer and it's probably exhausted. And they look at it and they see this high level of lactate in the muscle. And then they assume that it's a fatigue agent or a waste product of metabolism. And literally 200 plus years, right, of that concept. And I think part of the story is an acid-base dynamics, like understanding that wasn't until probably mid 1900s, right? And there's a couple of people, if people are interested in the history of it and getting some facts around it, is George Brooks, right? It's kind of the lactate guru. Bruce Gladden is another one if people want to look him up. And then I think David Poole, and they've got, anaerobic threshold, 50-year controversy, right? And you can, go down the rabbit hole if you want to, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't, and there's this concept called the Warburg effect, right? And they're starting to see lactate. Why is lactate present in the body in the presence of oxygen? There's plenty of oxygen. Why is there lactate there, right? And I think that started stemming more examinations of, well, what is going on with lactate? Where is it coming from? And, how is it becoming metabolized, right? And I think there's this other concept called the strong, I think it's the strong ion difference, right? And you're just adding up all the things that are more acidic and all the things that are more basic. And they found that, well, lactate doesn't exist as lactic acid in the body. It's 99% of it that's developed is mostly turning out to be lactate, and then this hydrogen ion, right, that follows it. And they started learning more about the gateways into barriers of cells, right? And there's a thing called a monocarboxylate transporter, MCT, and there's 4 of them, and my type 2 muscle fibers have 4s, and they're major exporters of lactate, right? And my type 1 muscle fibers have MCT1s that import lactate or pyruvate or whatever, but that hydrogen ion comes with it, and the same thing at the end of glycolysis, right? When pyruvate's getting converted to lactate, it's actually recovering NAD again, so you can keep glycolysis going, in the cytoplasm, and then anything that is developed in NADH gets pulled into the mito and then goes into that TCA cycle or processed in the electron transport chain to make ATP. So I think it's all that, right? And they came down to the point where, yeah, this lactate is, and again, George Brooks goes through this a lot, that it functions as a signaling molecule, not just as a fuel source, right? You can call it, you were bringing up the brain and brain health earlier, right? The astrocyte is creating lactate. The brain uses a lot of energy, like upwards of 20% of our energy. And our brains don't just, use glucose immediately. It has to be converted, it becomes lactate. Lactate goes to the neuron. That's what supports that. So there's, again, there's substantial evidence of raising that the metabolic profile into dementias, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's have this metabolic piece to them, and maybe even post-concussion management at some point too, right? Which is kind of hairy. So there's a long, funny story. It might be one of those molecules that has just been so misidentified for so long, and now, like I said, there was a decade of the brain. A decade of genomics. I think lactate ultimately is going to be a more useful marker of health, performance, and probably exceed how we perceive of glucose right now with CGMs and other things. So there's just a lot of value to understanding what lactate is and how it works in your body as a description or observation of healthy function of the body. So,
if we wanted to measure the health of our mitochondria, what would be the best way to do that? I mean, it's funny. I've had, like, as you've been talking, like 1,000 thoughts, and I keep going back to this idea that if we could measure the health of our mitochondria, that would probably be a greater indicator of health as we, tend to age out.
Right. So, I mean, I don't think people want to do muscle biopsies, right? I mean, that's one way I think of quantifying that. And it's just, again, not practical. There's an approach called incentive spirometry, right? And that's essentially what you're doing when you're measuring gas exchange. And there's a respiratory exchange ratio, right? And 0.7 to over 1. And that's the relationship or the ratio between oxygen and carbon dioxide. But that'll tell you kind of acutely, what fuels you might be using. When you're closer to that 0.7 in that relationship, you're probably more at that point, probably burning more fat, right? And that's generally a parasympathetic state. It's generally the basal state that we want to be in. We don't want to be in a basal state where we're sympathetic and glycolytic, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a place where people are trying to use and measure for metabolic flexibility. But I'm gonna stick with lactate, man. I think as it's being rebranded and better understood as an indirect observation of mitochondrial function, and also structure, right? And we think about surface area, I talked about the reticulum. What does it look like when I have a greater reticulum? I can process lactate better. A point I didn't make earlier, when we sample from the earlobe and I get a number and it says two millimolar, that is the net product again of the accumulation versus the disposal or the oxidation of lactate. And that number can actually be pretty high at a muscle level, right? I might be able to generate a lot of glycolytic power, and it might be, let's say, 5 millimolar. But then I'm processing enough up to 3 or 4 millimolar, and my net product is like 1.5, and that's what I see when I measure it, essentially, right? So again, once we start accumulating lactate, that just means I can't even keep up from a disposal or oxidative standpoint. It just spills over into the system. So for me and for what we've created, that is the current best way to understand where you are at a mitochondrial health level, because lactate, has all these other functions, and it correlates really well, right? When we get to that oxidative transition point where we become more glycolytic, that first threshold, right? That ends up being an insight or a surrogate for what all these other things that we tend to measure as secondary variables, like blood pressure, resting heart rate, lipid profile, glucose management. So that's where we're at. That's where we're going. With the research too. Right now, we're considered more of a fitness-based approach to health, right? And I don't know if you've heard the exercise as medicine concepts, right? And it's a pretty generic way of how movement can affect health in the system from a primary standpoint, but also if you're already dealing with chronic conditions, how does it make things better living with that, and we're going to go down the route of trying to use this kind of platform almost like a software as a medical device in order to help people that are living with chronic conditions to improve this at a cellular level and hopefully provide more durability and resilience to living with chronic conditions. So it ends up being, kind of like at some point, once we have enough evidence and we have the conversation with the FDA that, we can use it for certain conditions and indicated conditions, right? And so, yeah, I know I'm biased, but my experience with it and what I've seen with people that are not fit, they're not athletes, they're just, regular Americans living day to day. And we know metabolic health is not good in this country. We know healthcare costs are going through the roof and 20% of the GDP, so there's got to be a solution. And I think we at least have something that is a tool that providers and trainers or whatnot can, utilize with the rest of their toolbox to help people improve their health. But fundamentally, your point is mitochondrial health, right? It's kind of generic and broad, but it is. Those are the patterns, right? The mitochondria either breaking apart and becoming independent. We call it fission, breaking apart, or you're stimulating them. They're coming together and they're fusing and they're creating reticulum, and that supports health, right?
Well, I mean, two things happen as we age. We lose mitochondrial density, so having a larger aerobic base makes sense. The other one is recruit motor units, lifting something heavy and doing something dynamic. And I've found that little simple prescription is by far the greatest chance I've seen for longevity, especially for health as we go forward. I keep, is it McArdle's disease where people don't produce lactic acid? Ever worked with any of those individuals?
I've never seen one. We've had someone one time. I was out in Jersey and we were testing somebody, and they weren't really accumulating lactate, but there were other issues that were probably contributing to that. But immediately, I was in my mind is like, well, is this someone that's undiagnosed with McArdle's? And I think that would be really unusual for an adult to finally recognize that piece. But that's actually a really interesting comparison. If you pull up, just Google McArdle's lactate curves. Their fat oxidation continues to increase all the way to 100% of their VO2 max, right? Whereas if you do have a lactate curve and you're non-McArdle's, right, you don't have a glycogen storage disorder, that fat ox curve will start plummeting after you get past that first lactate threshold. It's almost like a physiological law. It's inverse related, right? As I accumulate lactate, the fat goes down. So, and then in McArdle's, they can use fat. all the way to max, right? And I don't think it's necessarily a beneficial thing for them. You know what I mean? I think there's obviously benefits to having the ability to create lactate and use lactate as metabolic flexibility piece for McArdle's. So
yeah, where I stumbled upon it, we had Boyd Epley on the podcast, and they had created the Nebraska circuits, which are these metabolic conditioning cycles, and extremely intense, high levels of lactate were produced. And I always thought that there was an interesting driver with lactate in terms of stimulating growth hormone as a driver for hypertrophy and changes within the body type. And the research has since kind of not supported it, but they did research on people with McArdle's disease in exercise and found out that their bodies did not produce or release growth hormone in response to it. So that was kind of where I stumbled upon it and was like, oh, that's interesting. I mean, that's kind of you think about, if lactate is a major player within mitochondria and your body doesn't produce lactate, you'd be interested to see what their mitochondrial health is.
Yeah, I haven't come across anybody, and we haven't had the opportunity, I suppose, to look at that. And there's probably other people more.
How many of those people are there? I mean,
I don't know. I mean, glycogen storage disorders, there's other ones beyond McArdle's too, and it's kind of a similar principle. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they're managed differently, or I don't know what the rate is, or the prevalence in the population. But it's a fascinating thing to see, because I look at it as a relationship between lactate and fat oxidative capacity. Like there's a physiological angle there that's really powerful. Yeah.
So people are going forward. I mean, whenever we do podcasts like this that are, very kind of deep within kind of one discipline of science, I always think, like, what's the takeaway? Because the layman that's listening to the podcast is probably thinking, like, if they've made it, 90 minutes in, they're thinking like, okay, what's the takeaway? If I want to be the best version of myself and the healthiest of individuals, and the people that tend to listen to this podcast err on the side of performance training and this power athlete kind of lifestyle. But I think the takeaway is really just like the physiological effects of training in those lower heart rate zones of 1 and 2 pay massive dividends for the health of mitochondria, and almost more beneficial than in developing those than in the higher registers, which tend to be the ones that we kind of gravitate towards. Like, hey, because I think with exercise, there's this desire for a receipt. Like if I'm, covered in sweat, my heart's racing 100 miles an hour and I feel like I'm going to throw up. I mean, that was my receipt. I did something to get myself better. And, whether it's, like we were making jokes today at training, talking about, like, if the hardest thing you do all day is get in 3 minutes of cold water, we got to reevaluate your life. So it's just kind of like a spoof. We were just making a joke on the cold plunge, which is, taking the world by storm. But the desire that you don't need to leave every single workout, battered and bruised and crippled. And, and I think a lot of people coming from that kind of HIIT CrossFit background have that idea, like, oh, are my hands tore up? If they're not, did I really train today? And realizing that there's probably a hell of a lot of value in training these bottom, single or, 1 and 2 zones.
Yeah, fundamentally it's training for health and longevity, right? That health span concept. And we know in at least the literature that, athletes, even Olympic athletes that historically were power athletes, they live about 7 years less, right, than people that were endurance athletes. So there's kind of a characteristic or a phenotype of, from how you use your body, I guess, but also the genetics that drive that. But again, what I think what I want to convey is that people have agency over the trajectory and the magnitude, of the velocity of their life and what they do with it. And movement matters a lot. And movement matters because it does stimulate these mitos. And, at least, again, what I've been seeing is that it's not the redlining that's really going to drive things and help you. There's a place for that, right? There's a dose and a context for that. But a substantial amount is going to be probably these lower levels that really are, stimulating the growth of that reticulum as a majority of the effect of that stress, right? versus a stress that is redlined. And as you build that, it's going to afford that performance to be better. And you mentioned it earlier, even about lifting, right? Recovery in between improved loads. So it contributes to that whole capacity. It's not the only thing, but it's an important thing. And I think it's a really important thing that's been overlooked. Really, it is an easy thing to do. It does take time and effort, to coordinate that on a near daily basis. But if you don't do that, and you don't move essentially that, how we would interpret it as that first threshold, if that thing's not continuing to move rightward, at least over the life course, it creates a vulnerability, right? And things can start happening and they get more breakdown. And the longer you can hold that oxidative phenotype or that characteristic higher, it'll afford you a better glycolytic capacity, right? It affords you that glycogen we just talked about, that glucose, for when I need it for that power output, right? I'm not going to use it all on that front end. So I think overall, that metabolic health component that's anchored by first threshold and below, and being able to train there a substantial amount of time affects on the autonomic nervous system, right? It affects on fuel storage, fuel use, metabolic flexibility concepts. And I think it would be really interesting, like you said, if you had monitored these guys a year into it, earlier, where were they? It's just cool. It's really fun to be able to see that, and what is the effectiveness of your training in order to get there, right? Because I don't know, I don't follow, mixed martial arts or anything like that, but I could imagine that this is a huge energy system management. Oxidative glycolytic capacity is probably huge in striking and grappling and recovery, and even probably contributes to who's going to last. It probably doesn't help necessarily, the knockout or submission, but my gosh.
My fighter Victor fought in Vegas. Was it last month or 2 months ago, and fought against a bigger opponent. Victor's like 6'4", 260, and the guy he was going against is probably 6'5", 290. And the guy that he went against, younger, like 21, I think he was probably 250 a year ago. Now he's 290, pretty jacked. They get into 10 minutes of a pretty active deal. I mean, they were going at it pretty hard. They get a little break. It's going to go to overtime. They go to 5 minutes. When they got into that 3-minute deal, and he started pushing, because Victor had all of this, work that we'd done in this aerobic capacity. I mean, had the ability to recover, was still playing at a high level. The other dude, they got into a submission deal, and the guy just was done. He couldn't even defend himself, and he submitted him very easily. And there's a picture where the guy's like just laying there dead to the earth. And, he hadn't done that gas exchange work that we had done in terms of, increasing the plumbing, increasing the pipes. And we've just seen it really, really with the capacity for these individuals that, they put on new strength, they put on new muscle, they're getting more fit, but are they doing all this kind of, it's the unfun, unsexy, just time, and there's no way to hack into it. It's just time under tension. How much have you done? How long have you worked within that heart rate, and are you consistent in it? And then what does it look like for sleep and diet and all the other factors that are very unsexy?
Especially stress management, right? I think it's a big part of it. There's a guy we're working with, and I think he'd be valuable for you to have a conversation with, because I think it extends this conversation into what's more pragmatic and why is it important. His name's Andrew Flatt out of Georgia Southern, and he was football power lifter, and he's really into these concepts. I think he studies more of the HRV piece in power athletes and what value that has, but it's all kind of the same stuff, right? We look at the HRV as it's tied into this, and it's the same thing, right? It's an integrated physiology there's such an important component to performance and health that is at that first threshold, and identifying it if it's low, and managing it if it is low into something that's higher, because it'll help you when you're 20. It's going to help you when you're 90. Right. Yeah. And it's just it's a major foundation to how we manage energy and maintaining the health of the system. So
cool, dude. It's Interesting. I mean, it's amazing. I'm definitely, fascinated and want to look into it more. So if people are interested in it and they want to check it out and see what you guys are doing, what's the best place to reach you?
So our company's called Oval, OVAL. On the website, it's oval.care. We're undergoing, I think we're just finishing some rebranding and some website redevelopment from a content standpoint. So you can go there and you can see some stuff. I post some things on occasion on what was formerly Twitter, is now X. And then just kind of connecting with people in science in the lactate world and the application of that. So that's a cool platform too. But you can find me, Bryan Jasker, on that, and then look at Oval. And I think we're going to be at ACSM this year in May out in Boston, and then some other stuff. But we're starting to make some strides in military, first responder market, healthcare partners, larger hospital systems, and there's a need for this, and I think it helps to be able to measure it, identify it, and then it allows you to manage it. So
cool.
Yeah,
awesome.
Appreciate your time. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thanks for taking the time, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Power Athlete Radio. Hey there, Power Athlete Nation. Big shout out to all the heavy hitters who stuck around till the final whistle. If you've been soaking in the knowledge bombs and epic tales we've been dropping for free, here's your chance to be a game changer. Swing by klfi.com/powerathlete and toss a few bucks our way to keep the podcast fueled and firing on all cylinders. That's fi.com/powerathlete. Your support makes a difference. See ya.